we haven't really made the case as to why free speech is important. People approach the issue with the assumption that speech is problematic and that the only question for them is how far should you go in restricting it. The essential case for free speech is that it's often called the lifeblood of democracy. Democracy isn't just about voting. It's not just about going to the ballot box and putting a cross on a bit of paper. There's a whole process that leads up to that. That process is one of debate, argument, disagreement. And that, I think, is fundamentally why cancel culture is just so pernicious. Because there are certain people, particularly of a more conservative and right-wing persuasion, who do not feel able to express their views. So you tend to get this tyranny of conformity. The moment you have a substantial chunk of the population thinking that, you've killed democracy.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Barrister Jon Holbrook. Jon, welcome.
It's great to be here. Good to see you, Fraser.
So, Jon, few today would deny that Britain is in something of a free speech crisis. In fact, even the US government is constantly raising the alarm about Britain's slide into censorship. But I wanted to start off, you've written a paper on this for the Prosperity Institute on how we might reverse some of these baleful trends. Could you start by just outlining how bad you think things have got, just to give people a sense of the context and perspective?
Yeah, I think it's pretty bad. It's so bad that we've really had to invent a new phrase to describe the period that we're going through, which is why people talk about cancel culture, which is an expression that didn't really exist up until about 10 years ago, because the phenomenon just didn't exist. And what I mean by cancel culture is that people are now being cancelled for things that they've said. In other words, that can vary from just social shunning through to being subjected to punishments in the workplace, even expelled from the workplace, summarily dismissed. And, some people have even found it impossible to earn a living subsequent to an experience of cancel culture. So, and you're talking about there are very serious consequences there. In addition to those sort of workplace-based consequences, it's much more common now for people to get the knock on the door because of something they might have said on X or social media, a knock on the door from the police. So even the criminal law is now sort of coming at people simply for things they've said. And, this never used to happen in the past. It's interesting, Fraser, you use the word censorship. And in some ways, what we're seeing now is not censorship, because censorship is where you tend to try and stop people from saying things. The reason why it's better to talk about cancel culture is, of course, people say things because they think they are perfectly, or they should be, perfectly entitled to say things. But the problem then is the consequences that they experience. And that is very widespread. And I think, you can obviously say there's only been so many people who have hit the news headlines because they've been arrested or, they've suffered some of the detriment. But the ordinary public see what's happening. And so even if they don't know someone close to them who has experienced this, they know the potential consequences of what can happen. So the really sad thing is a lot of people just don't say things that they ought to be able to say. And in fact, in a democracy, it's essential that people are able to say those things. So, it's prevalent, it's pernicious, and it's fundamentally damaging to our democracy.
That's a really great summary. I wonder if we could dig in a little bit to the most extreme end, that is the arrests. I think a lot of people out there might imagine that, people getting a knock at the door for a tweet or for a social media post, they might think that that's stems from recent laws. Some people might blame Keir Starmer himself, or for, if not that, then maybe only going back to Tony Blair. But actually, these laws have a much longer and more historical tale. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. In my paper, there's two statutes that I've gone back to as being the source of what's developed now into cancel culture. And I think you can go back to the 1965 Race Relations Act as being the first modern day act that attempted to did criminalize people for things that they said. Historically, of course, you had laws of sedition, blasphemy, treason, but they're all fairly ancient laws. The first sort of modern day law that meant you could actually be criminalized for saying something, for holding a belief, is in the Race Relations Act, which introduced the notion of stirring up racial hatred. It's often called a hate speech law, but the reality is it's really just a speech law. It's the criminal law saying there are certain things, certain views you shouldn't express, and if you do, you can be in trouble. So that's the first act, which obviously didn't cause major problems at the time, but I think when it collided with the social media age, which essentially gave everyone a public voice, that's when we really started to notice the harms that these so-called hate speech laws have caused. But the other set of laws which I think are very important in this regard is to go back to the Public Order Act of 1986, which for the first time actually criminalized speech which didn't incite violence. I mean, prior to then, you could be arrested and charged if you said something that was likely to cause a breach of the peace, which broadly speaking was interpreted as likely to cause violence. But in 1986, the Public Order Act changed all of that, and the threshold then became causing harassment, alarm, or distress. Well, because it's very easy to cause someone harassment, alarm, or distress. And again, that law in 1986 perhaps didn't have major consequences, but again, in the social media age, that is another of the criminal laws which has been used to enable the police to knock on your door and say, "Excuse me, did you post this tweet last week?" And we all know what can happen then.
And as you said in your first answer, actually a lot of the chilling of speech comes via the workplace, often through people being sacked for saying things that they're not supposed to say. How does the law interact with that? Because I think that's that's worth dwelling on.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We've been talking about the criminal law, and the criminal law. The problem with the criminal law is it has expanded too much, so that people are now saying things which they ought to be able to say, but they're facing criminal consequences for saying it. Now, the problem with the civil law is that hasn't really kept pace with the problem. In other words, the civil law ought to be a way of protecting people in the workplace and beyond who are experiencing cancel culture. Now, as many people will know, Maya Forstater won a very significant victory in the Employment Appeal Tribunal in 2021, where essentially she experienced detriments in her workplace. Her contract wasn't renewed and so on. And she was able to establish that she had a protected belief, namely a gender-critical belief, and that her employers had unlawfully discriminated against her because of the views that she had expressed. So that's really opened up the door for people to use the law to fight back against cancel culture. But there are a number of difficulties with doing that. And the courts and the tribunals are very slow in grappling with them. I think the fundamental problem, and this is one of the issues I address in my paper, is that I don't think we should see the curtailment of free speech in the workplace as really an issue of discrimination. Because the problem there is you could have an employer who doesn't discriminate, but simply said to the entire workforce, "I don't want you saying anything on social media." So if that was the policy, then that wouldn't be an act of discrimination because everyone's being treated equally. But it would undoubtedly be an infringement of their rights of free speech because the bottom line here should be anything that an employee says in their spare time on social media to their friends, family, or whoever is not an issue which should impact on the workplace. So one of the things I'm proposing in my paper is that what are essentially the free speech provisions in the Equality Act at the moment are stripped out of that act and put into a new Free Speech Act, which would essentially simply protect speech. And it would do that by saying, as a broad principle, you have a right to say anything, and an employer or some regulator or someone can only infringe that right if it's necessary for them to do so in a democracy. And that would be a pretty stringent test because there's already laws that have grappled with that notion. And necessity is rather a stringent test. So most people who say things in the workplace would, under my proposed law, wouldn't experience the cancel culture problems that we know about.
And you mentioned professional regulators there. I mean, people may not be aware of the fact that in a lot of professions, if you can be struck off by your regulator. You can essentially not only be sacked from your job, but be told you can never work again in that field. That's Can you give some examples where that's happened? I mean, have you yourself have been, you know, been in hot water with your own regulator? I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, well, Jordan Peterson, of course, is the best example in Canada. Yeah, because he's not allowed to practice his profession because of the views he expressed, and they essentially said to him, "Look, unless you go on some retraining program, basically to so that you're compliant with our progressive views, then we're not going to let you practice." And that's a fairly extreme example, but as you know, as Jordan shows, it can happen. In this country, uh, regulators, I think the pendulum is swinging a bit. You mentioned my own run-in with the Bar Standards Board, which is the regulator for barristers. Um, they initially slapped a £500 fine on me for one of my tweets, and I was able to appeal and got that overturned. And in doing that, I was able to set quite a useful precedent, which is now of benefit to all professionals and who may be facing regulatory action. Because again, as we were talking about earlier, that means that regulators can only impugn what a professional person says if it's necessary for them to clamp down on what's being said. And of course, you know, the sort of political views I was expressing had nothing at all to do with the profession, nothing at all. And, you know, that's the case with a lot of the other people who I'm acting for now as a barrister. I'm thinking of someone who was an actuary, and his professional regulator didn't like the critical views he expressed about Islam. Well, what's that got to do with the regulator? I mean, nothing at all. So, you know, these are the sorts of cases where the law as it stands at the moment ought to be providing these people with protection. And I hope, and I think this is beginning to happen, but there's obviously um, more ground to cover. I think regulators are slowly waking up to the fact that they have to respect the worker's individual right of free speech, free expression.
And in terms of what protections we might have in law for free speech, you mentioned the Equality Act. People will often say, use the Equality Act. It's your friend, and you've highlighted some of the limitations of that. Other times, people will say, well, of course, we have freedom of speech because it's protected under the European Convention on Human Rights. Why is that obviously wrong? Where is this convention, when it comes to this discussion?
In some ways, I wouldn't say it is obviously wrong, because actually, the ECHR, the European Convention, I mean, Article 10, it does protect freedom of expression. But yeah, there is a but. You're right. But I think there's 2 points to make about it. First of all, as our own courts have often stated, that really adds very little, if anything, to our own common law respect for free speech.
Right.
So if, as I believe we should do, we should tear up the European Convention on Human Rights, it wouldn't undermine at all the rights of free speech that we have already under our existing common law. So I think that's the first point I would make. I think the second thing I would say is that the European Convention, and this is where it really hasn't helped at all, is that because it's a sort of top-down code. It's very much concerned with regulating what people can say. You know, people often say, well, it's not Article 10 doesn't give you an unfettered right to speak. It says you can speak unless, and then there's a whole load of exceptions which people who want to cancel you will regularly trot out and rely upon. And you really see the limited impact of the ECHR when it comes to so-called hate speech convictions. I mean, just to give you one example, a chap called Hammond, I think it was back in 2004, in the wake of of 9/11, he had a poster of an airplane flying into the Twin Towers. And then he had a crescent and stars, and underneath he said things like, "Islam out of Britain." You know, he was making a political point. But he was convicted under our hate speech laws. Now, he tried to appeal that conviction to the Strasbourg court under the ECHR. And the Strasbourg court, as is typical of the way it views these cases, said, we're not even going to look at this. We accept the right of every nation state to have their own hate speech laws. So that's where the ECHR really isn't helpful. In fact, it's been very unhelpful. And as I say, I think if we stripped the ECHR out of our own domestic law, we wouldn't have any lesser protection at all.
And let's talk about your proposed Free Speech Act. So, in summary, I think, is it fair to describe it as saying, get rid of all of the criminal provisions in the law that criminalise speech, and then have a sort of free speech protection for civil matters?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I do say in the paper I'm not a sort of free speech absolutist, because I do think there, first of all, in the criminal law, there do need to be some restrictions on what people can say. But I go back to the position that existed in this country before 1986, and which has existed in America for about 100 years, which shows that democracies can cope with a lot of free speech. What we had in Britain before 1986 was a law that essentially said you can say things so long as you're not inciting violence, and I think we should go back to that. So clearly, people, you can readily see circumstances in which people could be inciting violence, and that is rightly criminalised. The other exception I make in the criminal law is I do think there needs to be some additional protection from social media, because I think whereas with what I might call general public order or general speech or public order speech, people can generally avoid that. Whereas I think when it comes to social media, it's not always possible to avoid it, and it is possible for people to intentionally harass or be menacing to individuals. I mean, the good example, I think, was Luciana Berger, the Labour Liverpool MP, who did experience some pretty awful harassment and vile, targeted social media that was directed at her. And the person responsible for that was, in my view, rightly convicted. But I think you have to be careful how you draw that offence. It should be fairly narrowly drawn, and it should require, before someone can be prosecuted for that, they have to be menacing, and it has to be targeted. It has to be intentionally menacing and targeted. So they're the two sort of broad criminal law exceptions that I would be prepared to keep. Then when it comes to the civil law, as I was saying earlier, I just think essentially the civil law needs to do what the common law has always claimed it is doing, which is protecting the individual's right to speak freely. And whilst, you can foresee some circumstances in which employers, say, might be able to curtail that right, they have to be fairly narrowly drawn. I mean, the example I always give is we don't particularly want our judges to be going on social media and tweeting their opinions on political issues, because, when people appear in front of them, they need to know that they're approaching the case with an open mind. And I suppose Gary Lineker is the other example, because he was seen as the public face of the BBC. Now, you can debate those issues. I don't think that Lineker example is particularly clear-cut, but I think what you can say is that if employers have a legitimate reason to curtail what you might say on social media, then they should first of all have a policy that makes it crystal clear, so you know what you can and you can't say. And they have to be able to justify it as being necessary in a democracy. And of course, in a democracy, what is necessarily fundamentally is that everyone is free to express their views. So, the restrictions in the workplace and beyond should be very narrowly drawn.
And you talk about in your paper the need for an English or a British approach to free speech rather than an American one. What do you mean by that, other than maybe the obvious that we don't need a sort of constitutional First Amendment, which wouldn't quite work,
Well, no, I think that's the starting point, isn't it? I mean, we don't have a written constitution in this country, so we couldn't have something like the First Amendment. I mean, America's just been set up differently for 250 years, so we can't adopt their approach. But I don't think we want to anyway, because my view of the free speech problem is really that Parliament is essentially responsible. I know it's some people, and I can understand why they do this, they blame either the judiciary or the police or the regulators. And obviously, those people do have some responsibility in this, but fundamentally, I think the culture is set by Parliament and the laws that they enact. So if you enact laws that essentially see speech as a problem, it's not surprising that other people also see speech as a problem, and they're therefore always looking for ways to restrict it. So my answer to this problem, and this is why I talk about the English approach, is to say, look, if bad laws create a bad culture, then if we have good laws, we'll create a better culture. And that's what we need here. So I'm proposing a Free Speech Act, which makes the reforms to the criminal laws that I've outlawed, and also some reforms to the civil laws. And I think that's a very English approach. And it's also not overly prescriptive, because I think in our common law tradition, you do have to leave a fair amount of discretion to the judiciary. Obviously, you set parameters within which they can make decisions, but you have to give them some leeway and hope, as they have always said they believe in. They believe that free speech is essential to our constitutional setup.
And finally, is there a positive case to be made for free speech rather than a sort of negative case against not like, if we don't want to see people locked up or sacked? What's the actual benefit for having a culture of free speech that might arise from this kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Fraser, that's the fundamental point here, because for probably 50 years now, we haven't really made the case as to why free speech is important. So I find this a lot. People approach the issue with the assumption that speech is problematic, and that the only question for them is how far should you go in restricting it. And you're quite right to say, in some ways we need to go back to John Stuart Mill and On Liberty, when I think he was writing that in 1859. He made the case for free speech, but it's a case which has been reiterated by the American Supreme Court and also by our own judiciary in recent decades. And that the essential case for free speech is that it's often called the lifeblood of democracy. And it has to be the lifeblood of democracy, because democracy isn't just about voting. It's not just about going to the ballot box and putting a cross on a bit of paper every 5 years. There's a whole process that leads up to that. That process is one of debate, argument, disagreement, homing your ideas. If people don't agree with you, seeing what the counter-argument is, hearing the counter-argument, and making up your own mind. And that fundamentally is the case for free speech. And that, I think, is fundamentally why cancel culture is just so pernicious. Because there are certain people, particularly of a more conservative and right-wing persuasion, who do not feel able to express their views. So you tend to get this tyranny of conformity. People are always looking over their shoulder, saying to themselves, oh, what might the progressives say about this? It's far too risky for me to do it. And the moment you have a substantial chunk of the population thinking that, you've killed democracy, because people just aren't able to if they're not able to express their views, they're not able to even think in a certain way. And then what are you electing? You're not electing the true views of people. You're simply electing representatives on the basis of what people think they are allowed to say. And that's not what a democracy should be about.
Jon Holbrook, thank you very much.
Thank you.